All right, we are going to begin now, and more people will be coming in, but hi, friends. Thank you so much for joining us this evening for tonight's virtual event, How Did We All Come Here? A glimpse into the Houston Asian American immigration experience. I'm Tracy Anderson with the Friends of the Texas Historical Commission. We're so very glad you've all tuned in and want to encourage you to get to know more about us, the Friends. The FTHC is the nonprofit partner to the Texas Historical Commission, and we provide support for historic preservation efforts across the state. You can get involved by visiting the What We Do page on our website at thcfriends.org. Again, that's thcfriends.org. Thank you to those of you who have chosen to support us with donations through our virtual event series. We are incredibly grateful for that generosity. I also want to acknowledge any THC commissioners, Friends board members, and colleagues from the THC who've joined us tonight. We're happy to see you with us. If you haven't already, please follow us on social media. We'd love to connect with you. It's also a great way to find out about future events and programming, like our upcoming virtual event on June 26th, From Boom to Bust, How Oil Transformed Historic Texas Communities. We do have a Facebook page, an Instagram page, and LinkedIn. A few housekeeping items before I introduce tonight's speaker. I'm running solo this evening, so please excuse any glitches that may occur. I'd appreciate it if you keep your microphones off. And I did that and I just lost my cheat sheet. There will be a Q&A at the end of the presentation, and you are also welcome to put your questions in the chat box, and we will get to those as many as we can. We are, as you noted, being recorded on Zoom, and we are live streaming on Facebook as well. Tomorrow, we will present a link via email to everyone who has joined us tonight, and that is something that you can absolutely share with anyone that you want that was unable to join us tonight. And we will also eventually have this recording moved over to our YouTube channel. Anything that Anne mentions tonight that you're curious about, drop it in the chat and I will get information from her about resources like website links, book recommendations, or anything else that she might think you find interesting. So with that, it is now my privilege to introduce Anne S. Chao. Anne is a modern Chinese historian and a community volunteer. She is adjunct lecturer in the humanities and manager of the Houston Asian American Archive at Rice University. Welcome, Anne.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. Hello, everybody. I'm very happy to be here to share some of the research we've done at Rice University. The whole thing began about 15 years ago, and I had a friend tell me that her father was the publisher of the first bilingual Chinese-English newspaper. He did that as a volunteer. He was a grocer who sold his grocery business, bought a secondhand printing press, and started, printing menus, programs, anything he could do to make a living. But at night, he will write this bilingual newspaper. At the time that my friend was talking to me, he's already retired, and she said, I've got all these newspapers at home. We don't know what to do with them. And I also had a student at Rice who wanted an internship in the summer. And I talked to the then director of the Asian Studies Center at Rice, who said, Houston is a very large city of Asian Americans, and yet there's no real depository of Asian American stories. So we had this student interview Mr. Jean Lee, who then gave us all his newspapers, and that was our first interview and our first collection of memorabilia. Mr. Lee was interviewed in July, and he passed away in September of an illness. And he was extremely proud before he died that his story was finally recorded and preserved at Rice University. Ever since then, this was 15 years ago, we've had lots of references, word of mouth spread, and people would tell me, you should interview Mr. X, Mrs. Y. They're getting on in years, and their stories, if you don't record them, they'll be lost. And that's how we began. So it's been 15 years, and we now have about 500 plus interviews. We are Pan-Asian, meaning we record stories from South Asians to Southeast Asians to East Asians. And tonight I'm going to share some of the stories with you. So, so Houston is the fourth largest city in the country. We are very close to Chicago. Chicago's third, and if we grow bigger, we probably will be the third largest city in the country. And we are also the seventh largest city in terms of Asian American population. I had a student who used a heat map and then created this spread of the density of the Asian American population in the city of Houston. And they're divided by three colored dots to show you where the East Asians are residing and where the Southeast Asians and where the South Asians. And then just to kind of give you an idea what the whole group of AAPI means. AAPI is Asian American Pacific Islander, and it's actually a very, very disparate group of different countries, different people from different islands, and we all lump into this category called AAPI. But in fact, all of their stories, practically every single group came to the United States for different reasons at different times. And so our story is really very still at the tip of the iceberg. If we delve deeper into every single subcategory, we'll have amazingly rich ideas of how people came to the United States. In Texas, the fastest growing group is the Asian American population. So these percentages you see on this yellow bar is not the percentage of people in Texas, is how quickly they have grown in the past few years. As you can see, the Asian population grew by 5.5%, whereas the white population only grew by 0.2%. And this is from 2022 to 2023. And so in terms of numbers, the total population in Texas in 2023 is about 30 million. And the Asians occupy 6%, which is 1.7 million. And you can see the largest group is really the Hispanic population at 40% of Texas, and the white population, 39% of Texas. And in terms of diversity, Texas boasts one of the most diverse counties in the country, and which is the Fort Bend County, which is on your left part of this table. In terms of, we had at Rice University a sociology institute, and Stephen Kleinberg, who's now emeritus professor, had conducted the Houston area survey for years after, year after year. And he said in an ideal distribution in any place will be 25% Asian, 25% Black, 25% Hispanic, 25% white, which is the ideal distribution. Fort Bend County, if you look at the percentages, really comes close to this kind of ideal parity. 22% Asian, 21% Black, 24% Hispanic, and 28% white. Harris County, where I live, near Houston, Texas, we're not as well distributed as Fort Bend County. And then Montgomery County is the least diverse in terms of population. And so this is very interesting. So when people say Texas is extremely diverse, we mainly refer to Fort Bend County, which is Sugar Land, Missouri City, and Stratford. And this is just an interesting diagram that you can see in terms of color and circles, how the Asian population is distributed. So when we say South Asian, we mean Asian Indian and Asian Pakistani, and also Bangladeshi and Nepalese. And we talk about Southeast Asians, mainly we mean Vietnamese, Filipino, Laotian, Burmese, Thai, etc. And when we talk about East Asian, we were talking about Chinese, Koreans, Taiwanese, and Japanese. And when it comes, when it comes to Pacific Islanders, the PI in the group of AAPI, we're talking about Polynesians, which is Native Hawaiians, Samoans, people from Tonga, Micronesians, people from different islands in Micronesia. And as I mentioned earlier, all of their histories are different, and the reasons why they came to the country are also quite different. So here's a little bit about the historical kind of conditions that the Asian population found themselves in when they first immigrated to the United States. So, so the two women that I'm featuring here, and these are the women whose stories we have collected in archive. Viola Chen grew up in Chicago. Her father was an itinerant chef, and she said that when she was growing up in Chicago, she never felt any discrimination. And we're talking about 1940s, 1950s. Except one time when she came home from school, she saw in a store an ad looking for someone to be hired. She went home, called them, and they said, "Oh, come on down for an interview." But when she got to the store, they said, "Well, we're so sorry, the job just got filled." Later, she came down to Houston to help her sister take care of the sister's children. And she found that if she rode in a bus, if you're white, you sat in the front of the bus. If you're African American, you sat in the back. And if you're Asian, she didn't know where to sit, so she just stood in the middle of the bus until she bought a secondhand car and just did away with public transportation. The woman on right, Eugenie Chen, was a graduate student from Taiwan who came to study in Houston, and she was met at the bus station by her host family. And she was thirsty, so she went to have a drink of water at a water fountain. And she went straight for the colored water fountain. And her host family said, "Oh, no, 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 you should go to the white water fountain." And she said, "Well, why? I want to see what color is the water in the colored fountain." So this shows you that being Asian is a very awkward kind of position in the society when it was still segregated. And I will go through some of the legal ramifications of not having a real defined position in society. So there are four areas where the language of the law targets Asians. The first are the federal laws on immigration, who gets to even come into this country. Second is federal laws on naturalization. Once you're in this country, who gets to become a citizen? And then the state statutes, the ordinances. So once you're in a state and in a city, who gets to live where and whether or not you can get a job and whether or not you can even attend school with the white people. And then the last one is the requirement of citizenship for employment and procurement of certain services. So if you were working in a sugarcane field or picking cotton, which are really hard work and very badly paid, no one asks whether you're legal or not. But if you want to weigh cotton, which is a higher paying job and much less arduous, you will have to show proof of citizenship. And these ramifications are still, especially today, they are very relevant. But if we look at the Constitution, under the Constitution, in the amendments and the Civil Rights Bill, there are a lot of accommodations for people who come into this country. As we know, the 13th Amendment, when the slavery was abolished in 1865, in 1866, the Civil Rights Bill basically said that all persons born in the US shall receive citizenship except for Indians, for American Indians. In 1868, the 14th Amendment said all persons born or naturalized in the US are citizens. And then in 1870, the Civil Rights Bill basically said that law will extend equal protection to all within the jurisdiction of the US. And in 1875, even more magnanimous is the bill that says we should extend equal and exact justice for all of whatever nativity, race, color, persuasion, religious, or political. And this is what the Civil Rights Bills guarantee. However, when it comes to immigration, the laws are very different. And these are laws based on your race and on your ethnicity. So in 1875, the first law that came down against the Chinese. So the Chinese came into this country during the gold rush in 1848. And then when the gold dried up, many of the Chinese came to work on the railroad, on the Transcontinental Railroad. They were hardworking, they demanded less wages, and very soon they became really targets of white male workers. So in an effort to restrict Chinese population in the country, the Page Law basically said all Chinese women who came into this country are suspected of being, mistresses or prostitutes. This is one reason this could work is that most Chinese men in those days had more than one wife. So if a second Mrs. Wong came into Angel Island and tried to come in, the immigration officer said, well, there's already a Mrs. Wong in this country. You are probably mistress and therefore you shouldn't be here. And the reason why they target Chinese women is that this way, there's less likelihood of having Chinese families created in the country, and therefore there are less population of the Chinese. Then in 1880, the Angel Treaty is a treaty that basically negated an earlier Burlingame Treaty that was established between the US government and China at the time when slavery was just abolished and they needed laborers in the field. At the time in 1868, the US welcomed Chinese laborers, but then very soon they decided they were competing too much against the white male and they were restricted. So the Angel Treaty in 1880 basically negated the 1868 Burlingame Treaty, and the Chinese laborers are no longer welcome. 2 years later, even more draconian measure came down, the Chinese Exclusion Act, where Chinese are barred from coming in, especially Chinese laborers. The only Chinese allowed into this country were students, businessmen, and diplomats. In 1888, another law came down and basically said, if you had been working in the US as a Chinese laborer and you obtained permission to return to China and to visit your parents in China, and you have a return certificate, you are still not allowed to come in. That basically all Chinese laborers who have worked in the country, who had gone back to China, should not come back. In 1892, it was a 10-year extension of the Chinese Exclusion Act. 1902, another extension. In 1904, an indefinite extension of Chinese Exclusion Act. And all of these exclusion acts against the Chinese were not repealed until 1943, when China entered World War II with the US and the ally, and the US had to treat the Chinese people here in this country much better. So exclusion of Asians was not just restricted to Chinese. So when the Chinese laborers couldn't come in, the Japanese laborers came in to take their place. However, by 1908, there were too many Japanese workers in this country, according to the white male workers. So Japan was a very strong country in the early 20th century. The US could not deal with the Japanese laborers the way they did with the Chinese and mistreat them. So a gentleman's agreement was established for the Japanese, basically saying Japan will voluntarily restrict the number of Japanese coming to this country. And meanwhile, the US government will treat the Japanese in this country in a more fair and equitable way. In other words, they can go to school with the white children in many other places where Chinese couldn't. So when the Japanese couldn't come in, the US still needed laborers, and they reached out for Indians and South Asians. By 1917, the Indians and South Asians earned the ire of the white male workers. So an Immigration Act came down to bar the entry of people from this Asiatic bar zone, which meant the countries in India, Burma, Thailand, Malaysia, all of these people were not allowed to come in. And then by 1924, the government rearranged the immigration law and basically said that immigration, the number of people coming in, will follow a national origins quota, which meant 2% of the people existing in this country of different nationality were allowed in. So if there were 100,000 Chinese, then 2% of 100,000 would be allowed in. And there were, let's say, 500,000 French people, then 2% of 500,000 will come in. Basically, this also favored the existing ethnic population here, basically favored Europeans. And then by 1952, another adjustment to Immigration Act followed, which meant that all of Asia is considered in the Asian Pacific Triangle, and 2,000 immigrants from all of Asia were allowed in, 2,000 were allowed in per year. And again, that restricted number of Asians. Finally, the Immigration Act of 1965 came down, where 170,000 immigrants were allowed in from the Eastern Hemisphere of the world, and 120,000 came in from the Western Hemisphere. This is when you see so many professionals from India, from China came in, and the medical doctors, the professional engineers, all came in during this after the relaxation of the Immigration Act of 1965. The Asians did not always take these laws lying down. Some of them hired the best lawyers in the country and fought all the way to the Supreme Court. So Che Ping in 1889 basically said that I had gone back to China. And before I left, I was working in San Francisco. Before I left, I obtained a certificate, a permission to return from the US government. I went back to China to visit my parents. When I came back, I wasn't allowed in because the Scott Act had already come down. And he sued all the way to the United States Supreme Court. The Supreme Court sided with the government and he was turned back. In 1893, Feng Yueting was a laborer. He and his friends were not able to obtain a certificate of residence. And again, that certificate was only targeted towards Chinese. If you're Italian or French or German, you are immigrant, you did not need any kind of certificate of residence. Feng Yueting and his friends needed one, but they were moving from city to city looking for jobs. They did not have a certificate of residence and they were deported. And finally, Wong King Ark was born in this country. And we hear a lot about birthright citizenship right now. So one can argue for citizenship, saying that the law said anybody who was born in this country deserves to be a US citizen. He fought all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court did side with him, saying, yes, if you're born in this country, you are a citizen. So basically, these laws are judging people on the value of their race, religion, political beliefs, sexual orientation, other arbitrary criteria. So if you apply this to a US citizen, it would be considered unconstitutional. And as you know, this is so relevant today as we hear all kinds of deportation cases in the news. So the one principle that allow the government to bar people from coming in is this plenary power doctrine. And the Supreme Court basically cedes authority on decision of who to deport and who to stay because of this plenary power doctrine. And basically the Supreme Court said, over no conceivable subject is the legislative power of Congress more complete than it is over the admission of aliens. The power to expel or exclude aliens is a fundamental sovereign attribute exercised by the government's political departments, largely immune from judicial control. And this is the power that ICE today has to grab people and deport them. So, but if the key is if you're a US citizen, if you're naturalized, then you are very carefully protected by the law. So the question is, who gets to be naturalized? In 1790, the law basically said if you're a free white person and you're in the US, and you've been in the US for 2 years, you can become a citizen. And as we heard earlier in the Civil Rights Bill, how you can become a citizen. However, and then by 1875, the naturalization law allowed citizenship to be given not only to free white persons, but also to those of African descent and African nativity. In the case of Ri Yup, he is Chinese, and he said that I have lived in this country for many, many years. I deserve to be a citizen. Well, Judge Lorenzo Sawyer is saying that we want to know if you are a citizen, a native of China, and you're a Mongolian race. If you're a Mongolian race, is Mongolian race a white person within the meaning of the statute? And it's actually not very clear because in 1852, when the US government wanted the Chinese to come in to take the place of the freed slaves work, yeah, they were considered white. But then very soon, in 2 years' time, the definition of white started excluding people with colors, whose skin color is black, yellow, and all other colors. But then it also, singled out certain people to be white, even though they're Asian. So the Japanese in 1870s were considered Turks and Arabians, Frenchmen of the East, so they were white. But however, by 1902, things have very much changed. So in this case of Takuji Yamashita in 1902, who sued all the way to the Supreme Court, Yamashita was a graduate of the University of Washington Law School. He apparently aced his bar exam and he's all ready to practice law. But he was barred from practicing because he was born in Japan and therefore he's not naturalized, not a US citizen, and therefore unable to practice law. Mr. Ozawa in 1922 also sued to the Supreme Court saying, I have lived in the United States for 20 years, even though I was born in Japan, I feel a lot more American than Japanese, and I think I deserve to be a citizen. The Supreme Court sided with the government saying that you're you're Japanese, you're Mongolian, you're no longer white, and therefore you cannot be a citizen. And in 1923, Mr. Bhagat Singh Thai, who's South Asian, said that, you have accorded citizenship to Caucasians, and we Indians are Caucasians. The government said, yeah, yes, you are Caucasian, but you're a brown colored Caucasian, you're not a white colored Caucasian, therefore you do not deserve to be a citizen. So all of these things were finally repealed after 1943. As I mentioned, when China entered World War II with the United States, the Chinese citizens received better treatment here in this country. And finally, if they fit the right qualification, they can apply for citizenship. The Indians and the Filipinos gained that right in 1946, and all the other Asians gained this right by 1952. So in Texas, the Asian experience is also quite checkered. In 1880s, a Chinese was murdered by an Irish workman, and then the case came up in the court of Judge Roy Bean, who's used to judging cases in a bar. And as he was deliberating, about 200 of this Irish murderers friends, colleagues came and demonstrated in front of the bar and basically threatened the judge, saying, if you find our friend guilty, you will be lynched. So the judge said, I find the law very explicit on murdering your fellow man, but there's nothing here about killing a Chinaman. Case dismissed. So if you're Chinese in Texas in 1880, you really have absolutely no legal protection. So understandably, there were very few Chinese in Texas. From 1905 to 1920, a friend of mine went through the yellow pages and can only find 2 laundry shops and maybe 3 restaurants that have Chinese names. So after the abolition of slavery, as many of you know, a set of Jim Crow laws came down in 34 states, targeting the African American population. But many of these states also used Jim Crow laws to target Asians. And we will see later in the stories how many got affected. But even then, the Houston Telegraph in 1870 found that the few Chinese were here had no intention of being common laborers all of their lives. They've been saving their earnings. Aside from the amount sent back to China, they want to go into business for themselves and they will not stay as laborers. In Texas, Chinese were able to go to school with the whites. And Martha Wong is one of our interviewees. She's actually a PhD and she also is a council member. Her father had a grocery store in Mississippi, and when the Chinese kids couldn't go to school with the white kids in Mississippi, he sold his business, came to Houston, and then his daughter went to school with the white, and she, of course, got a PhD. There were deed restrictions in Texas, in Houston, prohibiting sale of property to non-whites or to Mongolians, and the Asians here suffered daily indignities. This picture, you see a person in white is probably a Chinese person, probably laundryman, trying to get on the sidewalk, but here's a white guy blocking his path. We were able to interview many Asian Americans with the last name of G in Houston. They're an incredibly united, generous family group that many of them took each other under the wing. So the patriarch came from a place in Canton in China, in the southwest China called Taishan. They came here, they opened restaurants, they opened grocery stores. And when many of their compatriots came from the same village, they would take them in and then give them, a place to sleep and then help them start a small grocery store business or restaurant. And then they're generous to the point that if somebody said, my last name is G, and even though they didn't come from their village, they would still help them. And to every year, to this day, since the 1950s, they would hold an annual G Family Association dinner, and now it's growing to hundreds of people. And many of them are very accomplished, and I'll mention some of the stories. And this is a tree that one of my students, interns, who after interviewing many of them and piecing together all of our stories, created this family tree. So one of our interviewees, so the G family, Harry G. Sr., this person here, had 5 restaurants in Houston. He immigrated to Houston oh no, to US from Canton when he was very young. He worked very, very hard washing dishes in restaurants and eventually opened his own restaurant in New Orleans. And then he realized that Houston is in the energy corridor. So he began moving his restaurant from New Orleans to Lake Charles and finally to Houston. And one of the restaurants that he owns, China Star, had an annual sales in 1951 of 75 to $100,000. I found out that information from a book, it's a financial assessment book that went around the country and done on Bradstreet, and I found the sales of that restaurant of 75,000 to 100,000. The restaurant that you see below, the China Clipper, according to Harry G. Sr.'s son, Harry G. Jr., this was probably the sale price of the restaurant after he sold it. But it is quite remarkable how well-to-do the restaurants were. Um, then his cousin, Albert G., owned even more restaurants. And again, Ding Hao had also an annual sales 75 to 100,000. And this is a number in 1950s. There were smaller restaurants, the Chester G restaurants, Gordon and Betty G's restaurants. So these are much smaller, but there are some pretty serious restaurants in there. And Harry G's restaurant had orchestras, and they did not sell just Chinese food. They sold comfort Southern food like fried chicken, steak, and fried shrimp and fried chicken. So Albert G is someone I sing along often because of his amazing brilliance and charismatic attempt. So this is him in this picture with Bob Hope. And this is him, a picture with Richard Nixon and John Connolly. So what happened is that he has a restaurant called Poly-Asian that served not just Chinese food, it served Hawaiian luau, it served Japanese sushi. He had waitresses dressed up in Japanese kimonos, so Hawaiian outfits. And his restaurant, the Poly-Asian, was on Main Street in Houston, next to the Shamrock Hotel. The Shamrock Hotel was a hotel where national performers such as Bob Hope would come and perform in Houston. The society columnist of the Houston Press or Houston Post lived in the Shamrock Hotel, and she would take these entertainers to lunch at Poly-Asian. And Poly-Asian, owned by Albert G., would welcome them, and he probably wouldn't charge them. He was very charming. And so society columnists kept on writing up Albert G's restaurant, Poly-Asian. And Albert G became very successful. He donated to the political campaign of Richard Nixon and John Connolly. So when Richard Nixon visited Connolly in Texas, Connolly threw a party at his ranch, and Albert G and his wife Jane G were invited. And here's a picture. Jane also, on her own, is a very accomplished person. She actually went to Rice University. Her father was a wealthy grocer in San Antonio and wanted Jane to become a doctor. But as Jane, entered Rice and she was walking from wherever she lived to school, she would pass the Poly-Asian or a restaurant. Albert G saw her and pursued her. And in 2 years' time, she dropped out of Rice to marry Albert G. And she said to us that for 6 months, she didn't dare to go back to see her father, was very mad. But once he met Albert, all was forgiven. Albert was also elected to be the president of the Houston Restaurant Association, which is not an Asian concern. It's a restaurant association that took care of all the restaurants in Houston. And Jane would write his speeches. And Albert, as you see in this middle cartoon, this is a magazine about Houston. I think it's the magazine published at Houston Restaurant Association. And they would write about Albert and his amazing food. He also created something called the haute cuisine and Cantonese cuisine and welcomed a lot of dignitaries in his restaurant. The other G, so this person, Harry G. Jr., is the son of Albert of his father's Harry G. Sr., who opened all these restaurants. Harry G. Went to Rice University. He worked in this restaurant, after school every day. And he said, I folded so many cookies, almond cookies. I don't want to see another almond cookie in my life. But he also was a cook sometimes in the restaurant. He would be a cashier in the restaurant. But then after, finally he went to Rice University and then went to UT Law School. He graduated in 1960 something, and no one wanted to hire a Chinese lawyer. So he worked in this with the state government, and he went to East Texas for the state attorney's office. And after working for 2 years there, he opened his own law firm, and he's today one of the most successful immigration lawyers. He's also part-time and part owner of the Texan football team. Regine G. Calvert is also a cousin of Harry. Her father was a grocer, and she also worked in a grocery store after school. She and the two other women realized that their parent did not have medical coverage. And so she asked, after going to university, she and her friends formed the Hope Clinic, which is a medical clinic for anyone who has no coverage or no legal status. They don't ask questions. You go to if you're sick, you go to the clinic. They charge you a flat fee of like $24. And then after they determine whether or not you need more care and more exams, they will contact doctors who are willing to take these patients at a reduced fee and then send them on. Today, it is a 4-campus, multi-million budget medical clinic that is also federally qualified. It serves clients from, 37, they have 37 different languages, they have translators. And for instance, when Katrina happened, all of the people who escaped Louisiana came, and many of them went to Hope Clinic for medical care. They don't ask your legal status, they don't ask your medical coverage, and it's also staffed by highly qualified doctors from Baylor College of Medicine, and it's an absolute success story. This woman on below, Linda Wu, she's the daughter of Albert G. and Jane G. She said her father was a rock star, and her mother was also a force of nature. In fact, after Albert G. passed away, Jane G. sold his restaurant business, which she didn't care for, started her own real estate company, and then joined ballroom dancing. And she actually competed nationally in ballroom dancing. Linda has taken over her mother's reign of the Miss Chinatown pageant. Miss Chinatown pageant was a small operation, but her mother, Linda, made it a very important and serious concern where all the young competitors, pageant candidates would receive etiquette lessons, beauty lessons, scholarships, and then Linda has taken over. Linda is also on the board of Asian dance companies and many other nonprofits and giving back to the community. The G family basically came into the US in 1940s, 1950s. A very different group of Asians came in, Chinese came in after the relaxation immigration law. We have Catherine King, who is a Dr. M.D. Anderson, Paul Chu, who's a superconductivity physicist who is on the Nobel track, Ling Chou Liang, who is a violinist from Juilliard, who's now a faculty member of Shepherd School of Music of Rice. Teresa Chang, she was a chemical engineer who went to night school to become a lawyer, and she's a judge and also the highest ranking Chinese American Republican Party. Chimei Lin also went to one of the best universities in Taiwan. She came to the US and she just retired from being president of a Chinese community center, which is a civic engagement organization that help Chinese immigrants with their language, with their immigration status, the vaccination, with senior living, with children's programs, and is highly, highly successful. So these are a very different group of Chinese who came in after 1965. Very quickly, I'm moving on to a different ethnic group, and we're talking about the Japanese Americans in Texas. As I mentioned earlier, Japan was a very strong country, early 20th century. So the US attitude to Japan is quite different from the US attitude to the Chinese. Texas rice is important, and the Texans agricultural community wanted to develop a stronger, healthier strain of rice. They turned to the Japanese and they invited the Consul General of New York, a Japanese Consul General, to visit Texas and to invite him to bring Japanese rice farmers to Texas. And he did that. And so many wealthy Japanese, and many of them, some of them even aristocrats, came to Texas to develop a hardier strain of rice. The motivation for the Japanese is that they felt landlocked in Japan. They were hoping, well, by immigrating to Texas, maybe they can create some kind of a colony in Texas. Sadly, the rice market in 1906, 1908 tanked. The world market on rice. Many of the Japanese who came, who had bought thousands of acres of rice land, went bankrupt and went back to Japan. Some family members stayed, and we interviewed a Saibara family. Saito Saibara, the gentleman here, immigrated from Japan to do rice farming, and this is a beautiful house in Webster, Texas. His descendants stayed in Texas, and after the rice farming went bust, they started growing vegetables and fruits, even opening hardware stores. And then his granddaughter we interviewed works for a nonprofit public radio station. And then the reigning narrative that many of you may have heard about the Japanese Americans in the country is the internment experience in World War II. So this gentleman, and this is a picture of the Japanese being uprooted and having their properties confiscated and shipped over to several internment camps in the country. Glenn Gondo, who had just passed away last year, was someone we would call the sushi king. He produced he had about 280 sushi stands in supermarkets, mainly in Texas and HEB, but also across the country. His parents were interned in the internment camp, lost everything they had. And after they were released, his mother and father ran a boarding house for the Bracero program, which is a program where Mexican laborers were able to come illegally to California to farm and then go home. So Glenn's parents basically created a boarding house where they cooked and housed these laborers. Soon they were able to accumulate more savings. They went to the East Coast and they came to Houston to open a restaurant called Tokyo Gardens. And then Glenn grew up in that environment and became a caterer for ANA Airline. At one point, he was a caterer for the Continental Airlines. Before he passed away, he had his own catering company, but he also ran all of these sushi stands in all these supermarkets. Many of the Japanese soldiers, once they were allowed to leave the US Army recruited Japanese Americans to fight in World War II. These Japanese young men were able to leave the internment camp and enroll in the US Army. They were segregated in their own unit, in the 100th Battalion, 442nd Regiment combat unit, and they wanted to really prove their heroism. And their motto is "Go for broke." And there was a group of Texas Rangers stuck in a mountain somewhere in southern France, and the Germans were at the bottom of the hill, pointing guns at them. And this 442nd unit was ordered to go and help save this Texas Ranger group. So they were at the bottom of the mountain and playing German machine guns. It was a very tough charge. And apparently there was silence for a while, and suddenly one brave Japanese soldier rose up, charged up the mountain, yelling, "Manzai," and his fellow comrades followed. So in the end, the Texas Rangers were saved, but the number of casualty of the 442nd exceeded the number of people they saved. When they came back to the US, they were not celebrated, they were not thanked very much, and they basically just passed into anonymity until the daughter. So the daughter of one of those soldiers, Donna Cole, who also owns her own chemical company, joined a group of Japanese second generation, those whose father probably had fought in 442nd, and created the Go for Broke Foundation. And they finally managed to get Congress to issue a posthumous, many times posthumous, sometimes there are a few left who are alive, a gold medal of bravery from Congress. And from there, the Filipino soldiers and the Chinese soldiers also were able to get their congressional gold medal. And then we move very quickly to South Asians. There weren't many South Asians in the early part of 20th century. Some came in as laborers, others came in as students. But because of all of these Exclusion Act and all these Asiatic bar zone, there weren't many. Most of them came in after 1965, and they have created a very vibrant community. And as we saw earlier in the distribution, the South Asians comprise a large group of Asians in Texas. A group of them created the Sri Meenakshi Temple, which is a temple honoring Hinduism from the south part of China. It's beautiful in Pearland. The architects were flown in and the materials were brought in, shipped in from India. Daya, this woman, her name is Lakshmi Sri Paramasaran. Lakshmi is the wife of an Indian doctor who had joined, when she came to Houston, she had joined a group of wives of Indian doctors in a club. And she was trained as a social worker in India. And she has heard, from gossip that there were women in their South Asian community in Houston who were mistreated by their husbands. And they said, well, we should do something. But it is an embarrassing thing for Asian women to admit that they have been mistreated by their husbands. So no one really said anything. So she and her friends were just chatting until one horrible incident they heard that a woman they knew had killed her husband, killed her children, burned the house, and killed herself. It turned out she had been abused, but she did not want to confide in her friends. And so at that point, Lakshmi said, this is it. So she started passing out her home phone numbers to friends and then said to all her friends, if you hear of anyone suffering, please have them call me. Meanwhile, she and a few of her friends underwent more social work training at the Fort Bend Women's Center. And slowly, bit by bit, from one hotline to having someone, just answering phones, and finally to helping women in distress leave their dangerous environment, creating halfway houses, creating English lessons, driving classes, helping them find jobs, and taking them to court to sue against their husbands. Daya, that was created in 1996, today has a multi-million-dollar budget. They field 4,000 phone calls a year, and they are helping lots of women in their community. The word Daya means compassion in Sanskrit, and the reason why they need a South Asian women center, as opposed to sending their friends to the Houston area women's shelter, for instance, is that the religion is different, the culture is different, language is different, food is different, and many of the South Asian women will not feel comfortable going to Houston area women's center. India House, created 2011 by many Indian Americans in Houston, is also a civic organization where they issue scholarships, they have computer classes, citizenship classes, helping the newly arrived South Asian immigrants. Sorry. The Eternal Gandhi Museum was created in 2022 by Atul Kothari, this gentleman on the lower left. He is an accountant by trade, but he thought that the message of nonviolence today is extremely relevant, especially for school children. And in the museum, they honored messages of Martin Luther King Jr., of Mother Teresa, and they're just trying to bring busloads of school children to understand the message of nonviolence. Other Indian American community help each other, help also. Pratham is an organization raising money here to send back to India to educate the young, especially girls of the so-called untouchable class with the most vulnerable population in India. Dinesh Singhal is a lawyer who also does many, many community work. He is part of the board member of Rice University Center for the Study of Women, Gender, and Sexuality, very supportive of women's rights. And then there are other organizations in their society, in their community. These are social literary organizations that kind of continue the cultural tradition of India. So Arya Samaj is an organization where they get together, children chant and also write poetry and remember Indian literature. This is a Jain Society of Houston. Jainism is a religion and very, very gentle. I would say religion where they do not want to hurt anything that's living. So if you're a pure Jain, you do not even eat potatoes and carrots because these are uprooted from the ground and causing pain. And you wait for fruits and vegetables to have fallen off from the trees or just haven't fallen kind of deteriorate or something. And you also say a prayer every day before you get off your bed because you may be stepping on insects, and you wear a mask because you don't want to breathe in microbe. Clearly, Jainism, when they moved to the US, they had to modify their practices, but they try to perpetuate their belief, and there's a Jain Society of Houston. A friend of mine, Prabha Bala from South Asia, South India, bring celebrated Indian musicians and dancers to Houston to perform as a way to continue and perpetuate Indian culture. So it's a very vibrant community. Moving on to the Filipinos. Philippines actually was a protectorate of the US after the Spanish US War in the 19th century. So Filipinos were able to come into the US without having go through the kind of immigration restrictions that other Asians faced. They are very popular with white women, and they often marry them, and that got on the nerve of the white male in this country. So basically, two senators, Tidings McDuffie, created a 1934 act where it called for the US to help the Philippines become independent. And when you do that, the Filipinos in this country suddenly became aliens because they have a country on their own. And therefore, this is the way.
Kindness wasn't old enough to speak.
I'm sorry. So this is a way to restrict immigration of Filipinos. The Filipinos also fought in World War II in the Asian theater. There's a horrific Bataan death march where the Japanese marched the Filipino POWs and American POWs through really bad jungle land, and then lots and lots of people died. Again, their heroism was not celebrated after World War II, and the granddaughter of one of them, the soldiers Hannis, and the granddaughter is Christy, and she also worked like Donna Cole to get Congress to finally issue a congressional gold medal for the heroism of the Filipino soldiers, and a moving ceremony was conducted at Rice University posthumously for her grandfather. Today, we know that many of the Filipino immigrants are in the medical field. They are nurses, they're doctors. They do great service for our country here. And the reason why they are here and not serving their own population in the Philippines is because the pay scale is, really, really different. A resident, I think the pay scale is something like 3 times. You get paid 3 times as much if you're in this country than you were in the Philippines. Elnora Peralta was the president of the Filipino Nurses Association, and she came because in the 1970s, I think friends of hers who were already here told her, we need nursing staff. You can just come into this country. And so she came in very quickly, passed all of the immigration regulations, and then finally settled in Houston, Texas. And she loves this country and said, if you really work hard, you can succeed in this country. And then today we also interview many other Filipinos, Americans who are not in the medical field. We have amazing artists. So Anthony Pabilano, this person on your left, is an accountant by day, but he used paper cutting to create beautiful artwork with a social justice theme. And here is picture of Black Lives Matter, his rendition. And then Matt Manalo is now gaining national recognition. He uses ship containers and create all kinds of art. And he has an A-leaf art house on a piece of land in A-leaf where there's wonderful installation art in his ship containers. Then we move on to the Korean Americans. The Korean Americans, sorry, let me turn off the phone. Sorry. The Korean Americans also did not come in large numbers in the early 20th century. One of the reasons is that Korean emperor forbade Koreans from leaving Korea. So there were very few laborers. But at the same time, there were missionaries, a missionary named Horace Allen, who went to Korea to proselytize, but he also happens to be a medical doctor. And during his stay there, the brother-in-law of the emperor was shot by an assassin. And Horace Allen was able to cure the brother-in-law and therefore gain the confidence and trust of the emperor. So he persuaded the emperor that it is okay for Koreans to come to the United States. And basically there was a shortage of laborers in Hawaii. So many of the Koreans came in as laborers in the sugarcane fields in Hawaii. Horace Allen did more than that. He actually started a bank for immigration in Korea. He also started Immigration Bureau in Korea, and then started an embassy in Washington to take care of these Korean immigrants once they came. So he did a great deal of, he was very important in the immigration of Korean Americans to United States in the early 20th century. Today, I think many of you have visited Korean restaurants, Korean supermarkets. In Houston, we have a large chain of H Mart. We also have beautiful Korean clothing stores and delicious Korean food. We have interviewed a wonderful young Korean American who grew up here, and she was selected a Houston Chronicles Asian American Hero. She founded a company called Hope Biosciences, where they're using stem cell therapy to try to treat all kinds of diseases. And then we also have a very large group of Korean Christians in Houston and in the United States. And there are many Korean churches. We interviewed a pastor who said that my church is not Korean, it is for everybody. And it is today a very vibrant community in Houston and in the US. Now, the Vietnamese American story is very different. This year is actually the 50th year of the fall of the Saigon, or the end of the Vietnamese War, as we call it. The picture here, as you see on the left, is probably many of you have seen it. It is the last trip out of Saigon from the rooftop of the US Embassy. And then the other picture here is the refugee camp. So the first group of people who were able to vacate Vietnam in 1975 were Vietnamese who worked with the US Embassy, the US intelligence, US Army. They were, most of them by and large, airlifted or shipped out on the boat, on the Navy ships out of Saigon. Then when Saigon fell to the Viet Cong basically in 1980 said that, yes, if you guys want to leave Vietnam, you leave us your asset and you can get out within this very small window of time. That is when many of the wealthier Vietnamese business people, mainly, who are also largely Chinese, very frantically grabbed boats that they could and stuck all of their family, extended family, onto the boat. So the term boat people came from that group of population who escaped Vietnam. And sadly, because of the lack of preparation, many of these ships were not adequate to hold hundreds of refugees. And so a third of the population who escaped that way died on the sea. And we have heard amazing, heartbreaking, stories about the escape, and then also the really uplifting, resilient stories of the people there. This is a picture of one of the refugee camps that the boat people are often taken to in Malaysia and Thailand before they were allowed to come to the US. So we have interviewed many Asian Vietnamese. The artist we interviewed does laser cutting, and this is his response during the Black Lives Movement and also the anti-Asian movement when as COVID was considered called confusion or COVID. I mean, it was an attack on Asians because of COVID. The one person on the left, the lower left, An Lan Wang, is a woman who escaped 10 times from Vietnam. All the failed 9 times. Every time she went back, she was jailed, and then she would escape and come back again. And she and her brother, on one of those escapes, the boat sank, and she and her brother swam back to shore, but she knew how to swim. And she said, but a third of the people on the boat died in front of her because they did not know how to swim. She had then, grew up here, and she worked as an IT person in an oil company, and she's retired, and she's become a life coach. She and her husband created something called the Institute for Civic Education, and where they hire retired Vietnamese professors who would translate Western democratic philosophical tracts such as Plato, Socrates, Montesquieu, John Stuart Mill into Vietnamese and put them online, because this kind of literature is censored in Vietnam. And she said in this quote that I read out, that I need to serve because the freedom that I'm given is just priceless. I have to live for those people who died on the high sea, never see the freedom. I have to live for the people before me who died in the jungle, never knowing their future and their families. We also have interviewed nail salon keepers, and many of you have probably noticed that a lot of the nail salons here are operated by Vietnamese women. We're not exactly sure why, but from my interview, I understand that it takes only very little capital, maybe $5,000 for you to be able to start a nail salon. And also it doesn't take many hours of training to do that. So it is an easy business for women to get into. And then they tell their sisters, in-laws, friends, and that's why we have a chain and network of Vietnamese owned nail salons across the country. The other person we interviewed, Dr. Chu Dang, he actually was a PhD who just finished PhD in agriculture economics at the University of Florida when Saigon fell. He thought, well, I need to go back to Saigon and help the new Vietnam strengthen itself by teaching. Unfortunately, the Viet Cong considered himself an American spy, and so wherever he was in Vietnam, he was followed. And he finally decided, this is no place for me. I am going to leave. He has a wife and a son, and he basically told them, stay, because escaping on the sea is extremely dangerous. There are pirates, there are people, the boats are not safe. And it took him about, I think, 10 years before he's able to, he came to the US and able to finally bring his son and his wife back to the US. And when he finally came here, he said, being an academician, I interact only with my students, and it's just too small a place for me to be able to help my people. So he quit being a professor and he became an advisor to the Houston Police Department. And once he became an advisor, the number of Asian policemen increased from 20 to 200 to better serve the Asian American community. And also, he helped with the FBI to identify Vietnamese gangs who may be terrorizing the Vietnamese community in Houston. We also have interviewed other very successful entrepreneurs today. Some of them came with assets. We've heard stories of having gold bars sewn in their clothes. And some of them came with nothing, but really began from absolutely nothing, but working their way up to find the ability to buy property, and from one property to another. So we have Little Saigon, pockets of so-called Little Saigon in Midtown Houston, as well in the southwestern part of Houston. We also have interviewed seamen. So the Vietnamese people, when they first came to the US, they were settled in different military camps. And then eventually they were sent to Minnesota, Wisconsin, and the weather was just too cold for them. And they gravitated toward the Gulf Coast because the weather is much closer to what they have experienced in Vietnam. But also many of them were shrimpers and fishermen. And so they created a shrimping industry, fish industry in the Gulf Coast, in Kemah, in Louisiana. Unfortunately, they were probably too hardworking, did not communicate well with the local fishermen, and lots of tension flared up. KKK burnt some of their fishing boats, and we have other interviewees in our archive, and particularly an Asian woman named Glenda Joe, who grew up in Houston, but she was half Irish, half Chinese. She took upon herself to go down to Kemah and try to resolve the tension between KKK and the Vietnamese fishermen. And so many of the Vietnamese fishermen eventually created this vertically integrated industry where they were fishermen and they got their fresh fish and fresh catch, and then they would sell them to wholesale market, and they created restaurants, and then sometimes they will just move away from the Gulf Coast. So basically, these are the four major groups of people I talked about. You can look at the 500 plus stories we have when you click on haaa.rice.edu. So this ends my presentation, and I'd love to hear any questions you may have or any other thoughts.
So if anyone has any questions, they can drop them in the chat or raise their hand and we'll call on you. I don't have a few, so many people that I don't have a full view of everyone. So if people that are off screen raise their hands and I don't immediately call on you, then I'll have to scroll over. I don't see anyone. Oh, there we go. Peggy Meeks. Yes, what is your question, Peggy?
That was amazing. Totally amazing. I've been to Asia probably, I don't know, 5, 6, 7 times now in my travels. And I also mentor international students here, many of whom are from Asia. They're at the master's, doctorate, or postdoc levels. In fact, there's a young woman coming in next month. She's been accepted into medical school here. And I met her on a trip, a conference last Christmas. And I said, you know what? The first thing we're going to have to do, as soon as you get here, we're going to go eat some Tex-Mex. So she's just really cute. The thing that I mean, I know there are so many Asian groups. Do you have information too on countries like Myanmar, some of those, Nepal, Thailand? Are there stories and things, history? I mean, I'm overwhelmed with what you just said about the different laws and where we are now. My father, as a carpenter in the 40s, World War II, he built prisoner of war camps up in North Texas, in Paris, Texas. And that always comes back to me. I'm glad you gave us a link so we can go. Will you obviously, I hope, continue this research so that we have a place to go where we can find? I mean, it's very important to me to be able, I mean, if I have a post-stroke grandmother, I'm not going to feed her fried chicken. No, I'm going to try to feed her something, but we didn't even think about that for the longest time. If they were here, our clients, it's just all I can say is thank you. But I do hope that you continue and put more information in that link. I'm really looking forward to that.
Thank you so much for your kind words, and thank you for watching this. You're a very good question. We can't find enough people from Myanmar, Nepal, Thailand, to interview. We should do better because I've been a little lazy because people keep on telling me people to interview, so we go with their names. Most of them are Chinese, Indians, Japanese, Korean, but we do have a woman. To Dr. Dang, the man I mentioned, he is still working with the FBI and the Houston police. And last year he said, "Yeah, you've got to interview this woman. She's Hmong, but she
Ah,
lived in Vietnam, but she was a victim of a human trafficking. So she was lured to Saudi Arabia thinking she was going to work in a garment factory. When she got there with a group of women like her, they locked them up, took away the passports, paid them almost nothing, and then also restricted the amount of food they had. So then she and her friends started protesting, and then they were beaten. And some of them eventually even died from the injury. And so she was such a rabble rouser that the Saudi Arabian decided to deport her back to Vietnam. And she knew that if she'd gone back, she would be killed by
right,
these people.
right.
So what she did was amazing. She was at the airport about to board a plane to be forced to go back to Vietnam. She ran into the men's bathroom and found 3 Chinese businessmen and somehow using sign language or whatever, explained to them that she needed help. And luckily, those Chinese businessmen took pity on her. And I think they covered her up in their trench coat and then spirited her out of the airport. And then
Mm,
somehow they come to the right people, and she was sent to the US, and now she's in Houston, and Dr. Dang is helping her rebuild her life. And she was
mm.
willing to be interviewed. So my students do the interviewing, and we have the transcript. I don't think it's been cleaned up to be published yet, but I can't wait to hear how she escaped and how that happened. But we would love
Absolutely.
to get more. But I think you reminded me I need to go and find stories of the other groups, the Myanmars, the Thai, the Nepalese,
Right.
like that.
The-
One group that doesn't want to be interviewed, we tried, are the not the Tibetans, who are the people who are now being marginalized in China. They are afraid to be punished. The families will be punished, and they are the Uyghurs. The
oh,
Uyghurs now,
yes.
we have Uyghurs in Houston. He talked to me at a bar, at a coffee shop, and then he said, I can't be interviewed because I went back. He works at a US company, went back to see his brother um, outside of a Uyghur camp. And then the next thing he knew, his brother said, "Don't contact me again because I'm being punished for having talked to you." So he said, "At this point, I cannot tell you my story." So
Mm. I have, there are 2 girls here in Houston that are in the master's programs here at the university that are from Myanmar. And I met another girl who is, she's now at the doctoral level, but not here in Houston, but I've met her, and she is going to go back to Myanmar. She is working in hotel and restaurant management. Well, guess what? She wants to go back so that she can create a like hotel apartment kind of complex for those in Myanmar who were a part of that effort to get them out, who were marginalized, who were abused in Myanmar. So I find that rather overwhelming. Yes.
Well, if those 2 women that you know would like to be interviewed, please
Mhm.
contact.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah, I think I have my email address on the form, and maybe you can get it from the friends
Yes.
Sure.
like that.
And if you can provide me with the links and the emails, anything you need or want to convey to everyone tomorrow,
Okay.
and we'll
Great.
provide that with the link to the recording.
Great. Yeah. And I know a Uyghur here in Houston also. Yeah,
That's amazing.
I know. I
Thank you
know.
for doing this, for caring for the students.
I will be in touch with you.
Okay, that'd be great. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those words, Peggy. Does anyone else have any questions for Anne? Nobody? It was a very, very informative, and I love charts. So all of the charts, the Venn diagram, all of the wonderful charts were wonderful. All right, well, then I thank you all for having tuned in with us. Again, we will have a recording of this on Facebook Live. I made a backup recording on Zoom, and we will send that information out along with anything that Anne feels is pertinent with all the links. Hopefully tomorrow, if we have time to get it out. If not tomorrow, then Friday. I'm sorry, tomorrow is Friday, then Monday. But again, we look forward to everyone being able to share that link with their friends who missed it tonight. And Anne, thank you so, so much for that wonderful presentation.
Thank you. It was fun. Thank you so much for having me.
You are welcome. All right, good night, and stay safe. I'm here in Austin. I don't know where everyone else is, but apparently a storm's coming. So
Stay safe.
see y'all later.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Have a good night.